And now we can start having a discussion. Yeah.
I heard a speaker called Rory Sutherland recently mention a concept that he called placebo education. Do you have any thoughts about whether placebos can increase people's intelligence, either in short form or... I mean, he made a joke that Oxford's kind of placebo education, it makes you think that you're being taught great things, you have the confidence, and you go out and you succeed. So do you have any thoughts about placebo education?
Yeah, I think it's entirely true, except that placebo works. That's kind of a definition, actually, of a placebo effect. If nothing happens when you take the sugar pill, you don't call it a placebo effect. So the problem is, of course, why does it work and how reliable is it? For example, there are a few studies about giving placebos to people told that they're getting placebos. And it still seemed to work to some extent, which is kind of useful. But at this point, is it even a placebo? And being told that, okay, you're now at Oxford and you're going to do great things and you're going to have great teachers. Yeah, to some extent that's about external statement about the real world outside, but it's also, of course, manipulating your internal state. I know I'm not the greatest teacher around. I'm mainly good at jumping up and down and making people enthusiastic about the subject. Which is much better because you need to learn it on your own anyway when you're listening to me. So whatever I say, that's kind of uninteresting. I'm just sending a good learning signal. So I think there is a lot of truth to this aspect of placebo education. But you also get feedback effects. Having a lot of bright students around Oxford means that you meet a lot of bright people, and that's pretty good effect too. The problem is, of course, this form of placebo is also a social signaling thing. We can't easily spread that to every university by convincing them that they're like Oxford. Oxford is kind of based on the idea that it's kind of at close or at the top. We might try to convince every university, we have a new teaching system that is amazingly good and this is going to make everybody much smarter. And that's not necessarily going to fail. I actually think it has a decent chance to work. One way of actually improving people's mental performance is to tell them that mental performance can be improved. It's a very simple thing, but it's important to tell that to every little kid you meet. Because when you believe that your mental performance is kind of fixed, of course you're not going to try to improve it, and you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. But we're also probably that kind of pure, weird placebo effect we don't understand. There is this classic study of cleaning ladies at a hotel in America. Half of them were giving some kind of positive thinking seminar. The other half were told, oh yes, and the work you're doing every day, think about it as a workout. You're actually burning this many calories. This is very healthy. And then after 1.5 months, they measured various bodily states, and they did found that, yeah, there was positive health effect to the cleaning ladies who knew that their dreary everyday work was also an all-day workout. Exactly how that works on a biological level, I have no clue. But at least thinking about the information processing happening, I think it's very true that many of these placebo effects actually matter enormously. And of course, as soon as you get it going, people realize this is a great university we're having. Then that, of course, feeds into it. We're getting more of these positive feedback loops. Okay?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, you talk about something to help reduce existential risk, maybe by making us more able to overcome these. I was wondering what you thought about arguments to the contrary. Something particularly, I'm sure you're aware of Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu's arguments, that, and this is just that, well, as you increase cognitive capacities, increasing rate, that means existential risk will actually go up. And one method would be, it's easier, say, to develop a weapon of mass destruction, because it's really difficult with the physics or the biology, right? You know, but as you increase cognitive capacities, it's easier for a terrorist or a cult or whatever to get a hold of and release these. And you can show histories of various cults that would, if they could, have these kinds of massive weapons of mass destruction. And so that would seem to indicate that there is this downside. And I guess, do you think that this is overall not really down? Overall existential risk goes down despite this, or do you think there are serious?
I'm not certain. I'm not really buying Julian's argument completely. Mainly because the threat of nuclear weapons, you could say that having more minds is also a form of cognitive enhancement. So we should be really worried about the size of the human population because there are more potentially evil masterminds out there. And I don't think we're making that argument in the paper, but that's why we really need to kind of reduce or keep the human population smaller, because that actually reduces existential risk. I think generally the dangerous activities, they're not that dependent on geniuses coming up with it, because most geniuses do whatever they like and are not that interested in any particular X-risk thing. It's rather that many of the existential risk technologies we're thinking about are developed by deliberate programs. People with money and influence seeking out other people with money and influence, convincing that we really need this for national security, and then let's get funding for it and setting up an organization to do whatever it is that is dangerous. That seems to be the typical way we get a dangerous technology. And that doesn't seem to be much affected directly by how smart people are in general. On the other hand, we also have the counteracting effects. Having a lot of smart people around also acts as a kind of immune system for bad ideas. But generally, as you can see, these are very loose concepts. I'm not convinced we have a good way of doing a judgment of this. And I would be very happy to figure out a better way of doing it. But I think in general, it is like in computer security, having more people understand programming makes the internet safer, not less safe.
Do you think the internet has become more or less safe over the years as more people have gotten?
It's an interesting thing. People, yeah. Well, it always feels less safe because we also got a lot of companies selling antivirus software which have a very vested interest in making you feel that it's extremely unsafe. But we're also getting new threats, but we're also getting approaches to deal with them. Maybe internet was a bad example because I think the incentives for actually making it safer are very weak. We actually have a surprising situation where we're kind of reducing our resiliency in some domains. But I'm rather optimistic about it, actually. Any other opinions? Yeah?
Okay, I was wondering about mood so if human happiness and absence of misery is important, then it seems like there could be some potential to have a large multiplicative effect on this kind of really important thing. So David Pearce talks about shifting things so that, not so that we're always equally ecstatic, because then there wouldn't be the right incentives to say move your hand away from the fire and so on. But instead of having your hand near the fire causing kind of searing pain and having it away being kind of normal, having the normal situation be ecstatic and the situation where you'd be in pain being merely very good. And just trying to just shift that whole thing along so you still get the same incentive effects. What do you think about this type of idea? It would seem that if it's possible, it seems just kind of plausible to have twice as much value from whatever the component of all value is that comes from human sensations, to just ramp that up by a lot.
Yeah, I think he's completely right about it. Again, it makes me realize that maybe I've been focused on completely the wrong part of enhancement. But of course, the question is how doable it is. His long-term aim at getting rid of all aversive experience, I think that's an interesting question whether that can even be done. Both in terms of the kind of technical question, how do you actually rearrange the nervous system to actually work by different levels of happiness rather than having aversive experiences. But also, of course, from a more philosophical perspective, well, maybe if you're having gradients between ecstasy and mere pleasure, you're actually going to experience mere pleasure as something a very horrible state. But I think we can, even if we cut down things quite a lot, if we just think about our normal good moods compared to bad moods, just improving a general mood state, that seems to be fairly doable using various forms of cognitive behavior therapy and maybe some forms of self-hypnosis. There seems to be pretty good evidence that we can control our mood in a positive direction, at least to some extent. And that seems to be quite useful. We also know that there are certain neurological states which are much better. There are people in hypomaniac states, for example, really, it's very, very enjoyable up there. So if you can avoid getting into the total mania where you're actually irrational, it might actually be a very good state. And we know human nervous system can sustain this as a kind of standard mood set point for very long periods of time. And I would imagine that that could add an enormous amount of value. There might, of course, be questions about how mobile you are if your mood set point tends to be very high, whether you're having a lot of ceiling effects, which is something that's a bit of concern to me, because I do have a ridiculously high mood set point. And I'm really enjoying it up here at the upper limit. However, it's slightly embarrassing at funerals. At that point, it might be a bit of decorum to actually drag it down a bit. And maybe I should have a bit of wider dynamic range. I don't know how much value there is in a wide dynamic range, but it might be worth looking into.
More along the lines of David Pearce's thinking, the bioethicists talk very much about the pros and cons of cognitively enhancing other animals, whether we should do that, whether we could, and how it might happen.
Yeah, Sarah Chen up in Manchester has worked a bit on this. I don't think it's a very common topic, actually. But again, given the previous discussion we've been having here, that there are so many more animals than humans around, that it might indeed matter quite a lot. And at least when you think about the relationship, let's say, between dogs and their owners, imagine that dogs could understand human language a little bit better. That would be so good for the happiness of both of them. So I think there might be there's some interesting benefits here. Of course, the mood enhancement will still blow the cognitive enhancement out of the matter, but yeah.
You talked a bit about the trade-offs that evolution made in the natural environment versus the trade-offs we might want to make now. Do you think there are any other interesting ones, say, relying on the amount of energy we might be able to obtain in the ancestral environment, we might be able to fix that with very few side effects?
Yeah, and generally, of course, in the ancestral environment, we were quite nutrient limited. And today we have the opposite problem. So it would probably be great for us if we could get our brains to actually burn a bit more energy. There is a slight issue of actually getting rid of metabolic heat. I did a rough calculation about how much heat you could actually get rid of using the bloodstream from the brain, and found that you can get rid of about 26 watts of heating from the brain. And, well, the brain is about 20 watts. So the range here, you might actually need a cooling fin or something. But I think it's doable, and it's actually a very good example of something where we might manipulate it quite well. So some of these blood sugar manipulations are pretty clearly linked to that the brain might be running out of stores of energy, because we have very small stores. And similarly, we have the issue of the birth canal. One of the problems we have as humans is that ideally we would be born with very big brains, but that doesn't work with our hip geometry. So instead we need a very long infant stage. So one might imagine either fixing the birth canal issue, or having brains that actually grow even more when we're infants. Of course, again, now you get other knock-on problems. Having a slightly heavier brain, we need to make sure that the neck can handle it, and so on and so on. But that's evolution would have been able to handle that if it got out of the basic problem of birth canal. Typically, evolution gets stuck in this local optima, and then you can't get rid of them. So that's why our retinas are kind of turned the wrong way around, for example. It's very annoying, but you can't really evolve that back, because the chemical signals that set up our retinas, they got fixed a long time ago, and any mutations in them now mean that you get blind instead. So I think there are a few low-hanging fruits we can mess with rather few risks. More comments? Yeah.
What's the current sort of regulatory situation? I know a few years ago you were talking about cognitive enhancement actually being a specific regulatory route. Is that progressing as well?
Nothing much has been happening. I think the UK is interesting, because the UK is kind of more aware of cognitive enhancement than most other countries. Exactly why, I don't really understand or know. But that doesn't mean the regulation have changed. It's just that more people are kind of open to the idea, at least. Other countries are having a real hard time with, like Sweden, where the general Swedish view is, of course, that, well, cognition is a good thing, but drugs must be going to sick people, and they're very negative to the whole idea of taking a drug for a non-medical purpose. And getting this regulatory regime changed, that's a tough thing, because the pharma companies, who are pretty good at lobbying, are not going to be doing this kind of long shot at lobbying to get the government to change their views, unless they think they have a good chance of succeeding. And of course, the regulators, they're not interested in doing very much unless they feel that there is some pressure, either from the public or that their ethical experts have all been students of Julian and me and have changed their mind or something like that. So we kind of got a little lock-in situation here. But this might also be a cultural thing. Views on enhancement are, for example, much more positive in Southeast Asia, where it's generally regarded as anything you can do to improve the well-being or future of your kids, you should be doing. So we might also be seeing interesting international effects of it, where different countries go in different directions. Yeah?
So I know this is quite a big question, but how long do you think it will be roughly before we're allowed to research cognitive enhancement?
That's a good question. If you can phrase it as treating some real or imagined illness, I think you can do it already. It's just that how quickly can we foresee that people will get a more sensible view of it? I would imagine that it takes about a generation to kind of get the more flexible view going. But it's a rather slow going. It's annoying.
You could class it as kind of national security, you know, we need to keep up with Asia.
Yeah. That's actually a fairly realistic thing, because you can imagine Singapore, they are of course very keen on getting it, and Singapore might indeed, for the usual technocratic reasons, decide, let's make cognitive enhancement a national priority. At that point, a lot of others are going to do it too. But you can also have this weird contradictory situation. So, for example, the Bush administration was not very well known for its positive stance to bioengineering humans to be better. Their bioethics council was really amazingly bioconservative. However, at the same time, they had the metabolic dominance program and a lot of military enhancement programs, really clearly enhancement-oriented, but for military purpose, that were going on. Eventually, we kind of met and realized, and they both started hiding from each other. That's at least my impression of the whole thing. They realized that the two branches shouldn't be noticing each other because it was too embarrassing. But of course, different priorities do collide in quite odd ways.
So do you think there might be some value in setting up lobbying or campaign or something, trying to things like not being as alert as you could actually genuinely?
Yeah, one could do that. I'm not certain it's a good thing, though. Because seeing it as a medical problem, we can do more disease mongering, and I think more and more parts of our life get turned into a kind of clinical question. I think it would be much better if one could say, not being as alert as you could be. Yeah, that's a problem, and I want to enhance it away. Actually saying that it's not that I'm sick, but it is something that is ethically a good idea to improve your performance. But you might disagree. It might be easier to sell as a disease.
I think idealistically, certainly it would be much better if we could just say, I would rather be smarter. That would be a pleasant thing. But at the same time, if we are going to run into regulatory problems, it might just end up being easier trying to persuade the regulators that, not being as smart as I can be is a medical problem.
One roundabout way is, of course, to think about the dangers posed by not being at your optimum. So the obvious thing is truck drivers. They're not allowed to drive trucks when they're tired, and they have instructions to actually, if you can't avoid driving, at least drink a lot of coffee. And similarly, we have military pilots who have since the Second World War or before been taking Go pills, which are dextroamphetamine. But now, since it has some behavioral side effects in terms of friendly fire, we're moving to modafinil. Yeah, there is a hilarious court case. Well, it's a mixture of tragic and hilarious. It was a group of U.S. military at some gunship in Afghanistan who shot a group of Canadian military personnel on the ground. A typical tragic friendly fire accident. And in the court, they argued that this was because of the Go pills. which is not entirely unreasonable because you do get a bit of inflexibility in your reactions. You get this kind of stimulant drug tend to make you use well-learned reactions and don't think too much about it. So it's not implausible that it might have played a role. However, the US military is on the record as saying in this court proceeding, no, amphetamine is perfectly safe, which I think is wonderful to know. But modafinil, which doesn't seem to have exactly the same levels of mental inflexibility problem, since it doesn't go on the noradrenergic system, that kind of taking over there. But this kind of accident demonstrates that actually enhancing in the right way matters. If truck drivers were using modafinil, maybe that would be a good thing, that would save lives. And then you can of course expand that. The question is surgeons. Well, a lot of doctors at hospitals are up very late in the night and they're having very tricky schedules. And, well, isn't it a bit dangerous to have sleepy surgeons? Now, this, of course, leads to an interesting question. Couldn't we fix this in another way, like giving surgeons time to sleep? And the real answer seems to be no, because of the structure of how we do a modern hospital, that seems to be very hard to actually achieve. In that case, it might be very sensible to use enhancers to counteract that effect. But then we have the other effect. Okay, the surgeon takes modafinil to not be sleepy, but that might, of course, affect planning ability in a positive way. Which would suggest that, yeah, if you had a choice between an enhanced and non-enhanced surgeon, it would seem very stupid not to take the enhanced one. So that's the road we might also get a kind of creeping expansion. We haven't seen it yet, and of course opponents of enhancement say that this is a very bad thing. I would say, no, that sounds like a good thing. But it's worth investigating.
So I think it's very plausible that enhancement could be a bigger thing than existential risk, in the sense that if you could either, let's say, cut the risk of human extinction by 50%, or you could do enhancement, down the kind of whatever trajectory of enhancement we end up taking versus no enhancement at all. That it would be more important to go for the enhancement one because it could be that it would just make the value of human civilization increase by more than a factor of 2. That at least seems pretty plausible to me. I mean, even just, for example, making it so you didn't have to sleep might be able to improve the value of the human life by 50% or something, or by 50%. Or something like that. It's not really quite clear though because you might use more resources, you might have fewer people. It's a bit more complicated, but it seems at least fairly plausible. However, it seems that the big issue about extinction risk is the irrevocable nature of it. That if it happens, it's happened forever. Whereas it would seem to me that for human enhancement, that it's going to happen. And even if somehow we all became really bioconservative for 20 years, and had massive campaigns to stop it happening, later on people will be like, oh, let's do that. Once the tide went out on that movement. And then, because it seems like it's actually just a good idea, and then there's a correlation between something being a good idea and people eventually kind of getting into a situation where they do it, and then once they do it, probably staying on doing it because they don't have the status quo. And so do you think that there's much chance that in 100 years' time, that human enhancement isn't kind of widespread?
Well, it could be that it turns out that really useful human enhancement turns out to be hard. It might be that intelligence is for some reason extremely hard to improve, but we can do perfect attention enhancement. So we might end up with certain more narrow abilities getting very enhanced than some others, which to our current understanding would seem very similar, strangely unenhanced. But I would imagine that it's rather tough not to enhance if you have a good tool for it. However, the question is how good the tools are, and as we see right now, we might get this lock-in effect where we have institutions delaying things surprisingly long. So it might be a bit like many other technologies where, in theory, the Romans could have done it, but they didn't. So it took 1,000 years longer. It might turn out that there's some similar effects here. But I would be rather surprised if in 100 years people are not enhancing. It's just that they might have found other things to enhance than what I've been talking about. So quite a lot of the cognitive enhancement literature is kind of suffering from workism. It's kind of based on this idea that we're all academic office workers. Maybe because of the authors of the literature are academic office workers. It might not be the kind of enhancement people actually care about. If you think about the spam you get a lot of spam for Viagra, but not that much for modafinil. I think that tells us something very important about what people value. But I do agree that if we're in a kind of enhance the human condition forever by adding something, well, that can be an enormous amount of value. Of course, by that standard, also getting a more comfy form of pillows, or even a pill that makes me sleep better, rather than just to fall asleep. That would also be very, very useful.
So that's something that irrevocably meant we could never get that better pillow. That would be very bad.
Yeah, it could be. We shouldn't cut off the possibilities of better bedwear. Yeah?
So I guess I'd like to encourage you to say something more controversial. So far the kind of policy advice seems to be stop banning research into this, because it's on balance probably a good thing. You've also said that a lot of these cognitive enhancements, many of their benefits might be social. So individuals alone might not have sufficient incentives to pay for them, buy them. So the two things to tempt you are: is there a role for state subsidising heavily the research and production of cognitive enhancements, and might there also be a role for the state in compelling people to take them? Forcing our children to take cognitive
putting them in the drinking water. Yep. I usually start out with a fairly extreme libertarian position, so I'm usually not going for the subsidies. That's the first choice, but I do think that's a kind of a sensible thing. If it turns out that you would get a lot of benefits and not everybody could afford it, well, it would be pretty obvious, but let's subsidize it to get more of it into society. A friend of mine who I was discussing the issues of compounding. What if enhancements are fairly expensive? What do we do about that? And his answer, he was of course a Swede, said, oh, just tax them. You can of course do a lot of redistribution and use these things. So I wonder, what would it take for an enhancement to be so good that we would think it would be moral to compel people to take it? In the case of schooling, there is an argument. I think the only argument for mandatory schooling is kind of it helps kids to become autonomous citizens in the society. Without school, you're actually not really able to participate fully in society. So then you're missing out on a lot of both in the important welfare, but also on a voice, etc., etc. So obviously, if the enhancement was necessary in order to actually function in a complex world, that might actually be a pretty good reason. And I don't see that as necessarily an unreasonable thing at all. We're already living in a very complex world where we need lifelong learning. That's another kind of low-hanging fruit, by the way, we ought to be thinking about. We evolved in an environment where we were quite likely to die at a fairly young age out of external causes. Which means, of course, that our brains are not really optimized for staying alive for a really long time and learning and thriving throughout that. We're certainly good at retaining memories for a long time, but actually learning rates go down as you get older. And that might actually be definitely important to change. And that might be both kind of from an evolutionary heuristic standpoint, a low-hanging fruit that is fairly likely to work without too many hitches. And might be very important, of course, from a social standpoint, because you want the older people to actually be able to keep up with the rest of society. You don't want them to, especially if you have a very rapid rate of change. In a society where it's a low rate of change, old people are benefit because we just maintain the societal memory. If there is a more rapid rate of change, they become a drag because, well, they're conservative and they have views that are not necessarily based on the current situation. It might, of course, be argued that we still need that in order to slow things down to a sensible pace, and some of that wisdom is actually quite useful. So there is a slightly complex question about the optimal distribution of learning rates here. But it might seem that, especially if you have a very rapid rate of change, you might want to keep the learning rate up very, very high. And at that point, it might indeed be a good idea to argue that, yeah, you should put it in the drinking water. I think it's going to be a rather tough sell, of course, because people don't want their bodies to be manipulated by the government. And I think that's kind of a very valid argument too. In the kind of liberal democracies, after all, fairly based on certain rights to be fairly central. And if the government is allowed to manipulate not just my body, but actually the function of my mind, that sets a rather dangerous precedent on many levels. But still, it's worth checking. And I would love to actually analyze this question in more detail. How good does an enhancement have to be before we can morally say that, yeah, everybody must take it? Imagine it was a pill that made you not want to destroy the world. That would seem to be an obvious thing. So moral enhancers might be very good here. But again, raise some interesting problems because, again, the concept of a moral enhancer is itself rather complex.
I have a question about a very controversial idea, which I'm not, before anyone kind of glares at me, I'm not proposing as a good idea, I'm just curious. You've talked a lot about cognitive enhancements. Do you know if any military organizations or other organizations might be looking into the opposite, effectively attempting to make people less intelligent? And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there is. I was at an interesting little get-together about neurosecurity. You know, you can put neuro as a prefix in front of everything and get a cool new topic. It works. There have, of course, been kind of military uses of chemical warfare for a long time, but most of that has been a kind of direct attack on the health of people. But the idea of disabling the enemy, that's been around too for a long while, and there is something called BZ gas, forgot the exact chemical involved, which does have some interesting effect on people that is supposedly disabling enough to be useful. And the Russians, for example, they rather infamously pumped in some form of gas during that hostage situation on the theater. That was, I think, a neurolepticum or something like that. It didn't turn out that well, of course, because you can't titrate it for the body mass. Smaller people got a higher dose and tended to die from it. So that's kind of a general problem. But if you're a military, you don't worry too much about that. And yeah, there definitely seem to exist an interest in this. And the nasty part is it might even be able to sneak around some of the conventions against chemical warfare. It turns out that this convention against chemical warfare mainly ban warfare, but if it's for police use, it's completely okay. Now imagine something like Occupy London. Wouldn't the disabling gas be so useful if you're at the Metropolitan Police? And of course, even more if you're a less democratic country that actually cares even less what people think about it. I don't know whether there is that much active research into this, but it's not implausible that there will be. And certainly some people might be interested in just, what if we aerosolize the acid? People who are actually seriously thinking about that in the 60s, of course. For various practical reasons, it doesn't work that well. But I remember I was when I grew up, my grandfather gave me some interesting handbooks from the Swedish Defense Research Organization. This is one reason I'm here and this crazy. And there was a hilarious picture of LSD attacks on military leadership. So at least the Swedish Defense Research Organization was seriously considering, could Russian or American boats send the clouds of LSD across the country?
There's a really good film on YouTube of some of the British experiments with LSD, in which they gave a squad acid and told them to, go and and after, a few hours or something, the commander was climbing a tree, the radio operator was just kind of hammering his, it was just completely useless. Eventually they called the stop to it and just said that, it was completely but it's very funny.
Yep. So the interesting thing is purely disabling gases have their uses. I could certainly imagine if I were a military, I would say that could be useful. But you can imagine other things also that could be doing interesting and slightly tricky manipulation. So the hormone oxytocin is generally described as pro-social. And some people call it the cuddle hormone because you get higher levels of oxytocin when some nice person is cuddling you. And it does seem that if you give people it, you can spray it into their noses. They get more altruistic in various economic games. They trust strangers more and strongly and so on. But there is a few interesting studies that also suggest a more sinister side. It seems to be kind of a kinship hormone. It gets, of course, very strongly released between when the moms are giving milk to the babies. But it seems to create a bit of a more out-group bias. You like the people like you more. But the others, you seem to be more skeptical of. So you imagine that we develop that line of thinking. So you could either try to spray the enemy with cuddle hormones so they all become very nice and friendly, Or maybe let's get people temporarily make people really racist. So there are some interesting and slightly dangerous views once you start manipulating the nervous system, especially if we're dexterous at manipulating the nervous system. We might actually end up with some potential X risks, or at least GCR risks, just from that ability.
So maybe we should subsidize research into those things.
Maybe, yeah. The question is also the benefits. Again, I wrote a paper with Professor Savlescu about the chemical enhancement of love and marriage. So oxytocin seems to be fairly clearly involved in the pair bonding process, but we haven't evolved really to live as long as we do. So it's fairly likely that one reason many marriages kind of fade is that the pair bonding doesn't really take in the brain. Now imagine taking a drug that actually maintained that would keep people together and probably very much happier and produce a lot more well-being in the world. That seems to be a very good thing. But it might very well be that if we develop those pills, we would learn enough to create that racist drug too. So the problem is it's very hard to tell what we can actually use the fundamental neuroscience for. So that's another interesting problem about where to actually focus the research money. Where would it actually have the biggest effect? And then, of course, pharma companies need to kind of figure out what disease a short marriage is. We need to find a diagnosis so you can get medication for it.
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about some of the bigger ethical worries about cognitive enhancement. Maybe there's stuff in the handout we didn't get.
Yeah, I was kind of jumping to the discussion. Yeah.
Something I think it's quite easy, maybe in this kind of audience in Oxford, to think, oh yeah, this is obviously the right kind of stuff to do, but there are pretty passionate critiques of it. So, for example, Michael Sandel is one of the biggest names in political theory.
Yeah, so Sandel's criticism, that's that we're going to be kind of a lack of appreciation of what we have been given. And I think deep down this comes, of course, from a kind of typical Christian view. That, okay, we've been given our lives by God and we should be thankful for whatever He gives us. But he's done a secular version of that, which I think is kind of slightly iffy exactly how he motivates it. But I can certainly see the kind of psychological case he's making. That, okay, if everything that happens to us is something we can change, in that case, we shouldn't really accept anything to be bad, so we should try to optimize it, which might mean that we're spending most of our times optimizing everything rather than enjoying or accepting the parts of life. The problem is, of course, that, well, ignorance is also something that has been given to us by nature or circumstance. And he doesn't think that schooling is bad. No, we should really do our best to get rid of ignorance. There is an awful lot of things that we start out with naturally that seem to be bad and we should correct. And where he draws the line, that seems to be very arbitrary. That seems to be kind of culturally dependent. So deep down, I think a lot of it has to do with that framing something as an enhancement puts it in a different mental category. And then you can say, okay, that's something excessive, and then you start coming up with the good arguments against it. Seeing it as just as a continuum, then you start thinking about, well, where do we actually get a useful result from it? So thinking about the typical kind of criticism you get, in America there is, of course, the kind of natural law or God doesn't want it the argument. That doesn't work very well over here in Europe. Over here in Europe it's a social one. Oh, it might increase inequality. And I think that discussion, well, I think one can kind of show that inequality is pretty unlikely to be a problem. But then people immediately move to a different area. It's the typical slipperiness of doing ethical arguments out there, outside the philosophy department. Because people are actually not that committed to the individual arguments. They want to make a point. They think enhancement is bad. And then they take whatever argument works really well. So an interesting area is, of course, the cheating thing. And it would be cheating to take an enhancer. But again, that seems to depend very strongly on what domain it is. Yeah, we might be very concerned about students taking enhancers to get ahead of the class, and we might not think athletes taking doping are very good as athletes. But a mathematician proving complex theorems thanks to an enhancement, well, we don't think that badly of him. We don't say that, yeah, all those theorems on random graph by Erdős were no good because he was on amphetamines when he came up with them. that seems very odd. Instead, it's just endearing anecdotes about the really weird mathematician. So that suggests that it depends on the kind of social arena you're doing your enhancement in. And this gets very tricky because mathematics and sports are very well-defined ones, but life in general, of course, that kind of negotiation of what is appropriate behavior in order to get ahead in life, that is very ill-defined. I think a lot of this is because people don't have access to anything and don't have a practical experience. We figure out the social norms over time. For example, when it's appropriate to use cell phones, especially people have been inventing norms over the past 20 years. People were extremely uncertain in the 90s about it. Now we kind of crystallize things. It's not okay to do in the restaurant, and if you do it in the audience, you're supposed to be really, really ashamed and so on. But we have various norms, and they emerge gradually as we get experience with the technique. Of course, before that, in the 80s, we might just be doing hypotheticals about when it would be appropriate to talk on a hypothetical cell phone. We would be coming up with very strong principles about what's proper social practice. There is another interesting aspect, of course, that's the free choice. Am I free to not use enhancers? And even if I'm legally and morally free to not do, if everybody else is using it, I might be ending up in this situation where maybe I kind of feel compelled to do that. But that's true for a lot of other technologies. If I'm not able to read and write and trying to live a life, people will say, no, you should learn how to read and write. You can't really participate. And the fact that you somehow manage to avoid learning that, well, that's a cost to you now, but you have to bear that cost and probably fix it by learning it. In that case, we might even say, okay, we're going to sponsor help for you. So you're actually going to learn how to read and write. Saying, I refuse to have any cell phones or computer around me. Okay, people say, yeah, but you have to bear the cost. You can't get any sensible job, except maybe ditch digging. Except, of course, ditch diggers probably are now logging where they're supposed to be digging the ditches, so you're going to be in trouble there too. Let's see, there is a whole long list here, but I think generally developing enhancer, a lot of it is going to be based on research ethics problems. How do we do research trials? And this probably has to happen in a kind of realistic setting. We need to make use of the fact that people are actually taking enhancers, measure what happens to them, both in terms of health and actual performance. And that's going to take a new way of doing research, actually, observational studies. And that's not research bodies right now are very keen on. We need to figure out better ways of phrasing that. Yeah?
So we've come to 6:30.